Every country on the planet carries a hump made of debt on its back. The United States currently owes over $38 trillion. This figure is the highest in world history. The European Union lives with a hump of about $14 trillion, while Japan carries nearly $9 trillion. Even oil-rich nations like Saudi Arabia or export giants like Germany and China that come to mind possess incredibly high amounts of debt. But here is where the real paradox lies. If all countries have debt, who exactly is the creditor collecting this debt? This is the speculator's diary, the place where money, investment, mistakes, and history collide. And nothing is as innocent as it seems. Debt is not just a burden, it is the chief architect of the modern world. Every war, every crisis, every boom, and every bust takes place upon this invisible foundation of promissory notes. And if you investigate who the creditors are for long enough, you realize something disturbing and very striking. The entire world does not owe the money it has taken to a specific individual. On the contrary, it owes it directly to itself. But this does not mean that everyone wins equally. To understand how we reached this point, drowning in a sea of debt roughly $315 trillion in size, about 3 times larger than the total economy of all countries combined, we must go back to the very beginning of the story. No, the idea of national debt did not emerge after the release of the first credit cards or digital transfers in skyscrapers on Wall Street. It was born earlier than you might guess, centuries ago, in war. In 1694, England was at war with France and was running out of gold due to the conflict. To fix this situation, the king turned to merchants for help. They financed the king and his throne in exchange for perpetual interest payments backed by future taxes. As a result, the Bank of England was established to manage this new order. This event was revolutionary. The state now had the luxury of spending money it did not have. In return, the lenders received something priceless, contrary to what they might have guessed, a tradable, buyable, and sellable promise from the government. This was the emergence of the government bond, the seed of the modern financial system. France copied it. The Netherlands developed it further. America adopted this invention to finance its revolution and its expansion to the West. National debt, contrary to popular belief, became a measure of reliability, not failure. The ability to borrow meant the ability to govern. The more you could borrow, the more trustworthy you were. This was exactly the logic of modern credibility. Empires used to conquer land to possess more gold. Now they issue their own bonds to extract interest. In other words, the battlefield has turned from terrain into a balance sheet. Now let's wind forward 3 centuries to today. Debt is now the world's dominant export. The US owes about $38 trillion, Japan is over $9 trillion, and today, global borrowing increases by about $1 trillion every 100 days. Every country in the world is in debt. All banks are constantly lending, and every citizen over 18 is both a debtor and a creditor through taxes and pension funds. So, who holds the other end of the rope? Let's start the conversation with the United States, because America's debt is not just national, it is global. About half of that nearly $38 trillion story is owed to investors. If you ask who these investors are, 2/3 are made up of American banks, pension funds, and the Fed itself. The remaining 1/3, roughly $9 trillion, is in the hands of foreigners. Currently, Japan is the largest creditor, followed by China, then the UK, and others. So when people say America owes China, theoretically this is true, but it's only about 2% of the $38 trillion total. This means that most of America's debt is owed to America again. The system works like this. The Treasury prints bonds, banks buy the printed bonds, and the Fed buys them back and creates fresh dollars. Americans pay taxes, these taxes fund the bond interest, and the funded interest goes around and eventually reaches American retirement accounts. Debt exists, yes, but the creditor is not someone else. It is a shadow produced by the system itself. And this circularity doesn't just circulate within America. This cycle moves globally. Japan lends to the United States, America lends to Europe through the IMF, Europe lends to developing countries through the World Bank, They in turn lend back by investing money in Western bonds, and thus the cycle continues without stopping. This is a game of hot potato played on a planetary scale, where the potato consists of promises and the rules consist of evasion. Every country holds someone else's promissory note. Every promise is secured by another promise. It's almost like a poker table where every player borrowed chips from the one next to them, and the only rule keeping the game alive is that no one leaves the table, because if someone leaves, the cycle breaks. But there is a fourth and most powerful layer: the markets themselves. Behind every government bond lies a hidden network of institutions, corporate portfolios, pension funds, central banks. They are the real bosses of credit and debt. They decide which nation borrows cheaply and which must pay a heavy price to survive. If they lose their confidence, currencies collapse, governments fall, and debts rise. Democracy decides who will rule, but markets decide who will survive. The high priest of the system is the central bank. Central banks do not manage debt, they produce debt. Every time the Fed or the European Central Bank buys a bond, it creates new money in exchange. The debt of one balance sheet is the asset of another. Every dollar in circulation is the trace of a debt elsewhere. There is no debt-free money. Every banknote carries an invisible "I owe you" inscription. For decades, this cycle has continued to move with trust, and as long as investors believe the state will pay the interest, the machine will keep working. But what happens if trust is shaken? Yes, this possibility exists, and it has happened. Greece became unable to pay its debt in 2010. Bondholders panicked. Interest rates skyrocketed. Bailout packages arrived, but on the condition of austerity policies. Tax hikes, unemployment. Bailout meant sacrifice for the public. In Argentina, defaults turned into a curse. In Sri Lanka, the system collapsed when foreign currency ran out. When the system stalls, invisible creditors suddenly become visible. The IMF, rating agencies, those anonymous bondholders clutching nations by the throat. Yet even though there is a collapse, the same logic continues even after the crash. Old debts are restructured and thus the machine is reset. Because today, debts are designed not to be paid, but to be rolled over. Governments do not plan to pay their debts, not now nor ever. This is actually not a conspiracy, it is policy. When we take out a loan, we have to pay it back. But states treat debt like a subscription that is constantly renewed. They print new bonds to pay off the old ones, and this is called refinancing. In this process, interest becomes the main product. This is the rent that must be paid for the continuation of stability. The global economy is addicted to this rent. If this rent does not exist, this wheel cannot turn any longer, just like a shark that has to swim to breathe. The system today is still based on trust, not repayment. America will never pay off its $38 trillion debt. It will continue to postpone it forever and produce new bonds. Japan has been doing the same for decades. Yet despite this, their interest rates are near zero. Investors do not expect to get the money back, they expect to renew the deal. Why? Because government debt is the safest collateral in existence. A U.S. bond is not debt, it is an asset, the foundation of the markets. Pension funds, banks, they all rely on it. The system depends on states never paying the debt, because if they did pay, the world would lose the wheels of its most reliable financial vehicle. If the White House paid off the last penny of its debt, banks would lose their soundest assets. The dollar supply would shrink and the system would gradually collapse. Paying off the debt might look good, but it would destroy the very thing running the economy. That is why states do the exact opposite. They regularly create more debt. Debt is the heartbeat of capitalism. And when politicians say we will balance the budget, they're selling a dream. Their goal is not to end the debt. The real goal is to keep it sustainable enough so that the system does not stop believing in it. Because if the system loses its faith, the numbers no longer matter. Trust collapses, interest rates skyrocket, and the economy built on promises explodes. This is the secret of sovereign debt. The plan was never to pay back the debts. The plan was to make the world believe they would be paid. This is a closed loop of trust. And as long as the environment of trust remains, the numbers can stretch into infinity. But trust is not distributed equally to everyone. The saying, "we owe it to ourselves," is partially true. Interest payments do not walk equally in society. They climb up the pyramid from those who pay taxes to the institutions that hold the debt. So debt is not just a transfer between countries, it is a transfer between classes. The increase in global inequality alongside debt stems from this. The system rewards the one who owns the debt and punishes the one who pays it. If this sounds familiar, it's because it is the scaled-up version of the same story. Creditors are not the bad guys, and debtors are not the victims. They're two parts of the same engine. The problem is what happens when the engine runs out of fuel. When new borrowing is not enough for old promises, that is when the question, who is the creditor, becomes personal. Because there is not a single face to blame at the top of this global pyramid. It's not China, it's not Wall Street, it's not the IMF. It is all of them, and it is us. The modern system has turned debt itself into money. The government prints it, the bank multiplies it, the investor buys and sells it, and the citizen is dependent on it. The line between debtor and creditor has been erased. Debt used to mean bondage. Today, it means balance. But if that balance is disturbed, if trust is broken, the illusion ends and we remember what debt actually is, a promise that cannot be kept forever. If this gave you a new perspective, like the video and subscribe. We will continue to open the diary. I'm just showing you where to look.